topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization Show, the home of Googlization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on all around us and explore the disruptive convergence of technology, business, and people. Here are your hosts, Ira Wolfe and Jason Cochran.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization, a show from the People Forward Network. I'm Ira Wolfe.
And I'm Jason Cochran. Thank you for being part of Googlization Nation.
If you think this is just another podcast, think again. We are the heart and soul of the crucial conversations focused on helping you reimagine your tomorrow and exploring the convergence of technology, business, and work.
And on this episode, you are going to hear from inclusion expert Amy Waninger, and she's going to help us take this often abstract topic of inclusion, and we're going to break it down into 3 actionable steps that companies can actually take today to begin creating a more inclusive culture. And Ira, this topic of inclusion today, I think it dovetails perfectly with last week's conversation with Nikki Llewellyn, which was on the power of community. As we discussed then, we've got way too many folks who are checked out with their job, their company, or leadership, and they're not feeling any real sense of connection in the work that they're doing. And one of the major reasons why, which we're going to talk today, is because so many businesses are still struggling with bias and discrimination. And just like we talked about last week, you mentioned hiring for culture fit and how that often leads to bias in hiring processes. Well, we've got data to back that up. Only 4% of C-suites in the U.S. are made up of women of color. And then last year, of the Fortune 500 companies, only 22 of them released full breakdowns of their ethnic and racial makeup. Yet despite this, according to Deloitte, 80% of employees say they want to work for an inclusive company. So this topic of inclusion, which never should have become a game of tug of war between employees and employers, feels like it often stays just that, a conversation, and nothing else in terms of meaningful change seems to ever come from it.
Hey, Jason, it seems like deja vu all over it again, week after week. You mentioned 80% of employees want to work for an inclusive company, and yet a new report that was just released by joshbersin.com revealed that 80% of companies are merely going through the motions and not holding themselves accountable. It's really infuriating because after all these years, we're still seeing a lot of talk, no action, or little action. There is some improvement, but let's just look at women. I mean, when we talk about inclusion, it's a broad subject and can't wait to get Amy on. But if we just look at women in the workplace who make up 50% of the workforce, much higher in certain industries. The new report, McKinsey's Women in the Workplace 2021, just came out. And it's really an embarrassment it should be an embarrassment for most companies, and an indictment on how much change is needed. It said that while women made some gains at every level of the company, of all organizations, from the entry level to the C-suite, that women at all levels are still underrepresented. And if you looked at it, they also talked about, they called this the missing rung, or the broken rung, the broken rung. And for every 100 men who were promoted to manager, only 86 women were promoted. What that does, it opens this door, because if you're not promoted to manager, then you can't get promoted to the next step either.
That's exactly right. And that's why we were excited to have Amy come on the show today as an inclusion expert to help us make sense of this and help provide some actionable steps as to how we right some of these wrongs. And just a little bit about Amy before we bring her on. She is the CEO and founder of Lead at Any Level, which is a consulting firm that works with organizations who want to build inclusive cultures and diverse leadership pipelines for a sustainable competitive advantage. And she's worked with some clients like the likes of Microsoft, PayPal, and Delta Faucet. She's a certified diversity professional, a certified diversity executive, and a Gallup certified strength coach. And she's also a professional member of National Speakers Association, a certified virtual presenter, and a Process certified change practitioner. In addition to that, with the extra spare time that she has, which probably isn't much with all that going on, she also has authored several books, including Network Beyond Bias and Hire Beyond Bias. So without further ado, let's welcome Amy to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization show.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi,
Amy. It's great to have you on.
Yeah. Hey, Amy. Great to meet. And thank you for being here. What you heard the lead in, and we've been talking about this, and it seems to keep coming up. And it's not just on the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization show. Literally, right before we went on, I haven't even had a chance to read this. I got an email from, let me see if I can pull this up quick. Might have lost it, but there was an email from Alexandra Levitt. She's a writer for the Wall Street Journal. And the topic was, why are I'm gonna really blow this. It was, but basically is, why do DEI strategies not work? So we're in it here. We're in it. So
we're in deep now already.
I encourage everyone to go up and look up Alexandria Levitt's work. Once we start talking, I'll actually look up the link for that, or the proper name for it. But it was actually what I saw was, I went to the bottom line just to see if there was anything I could pull out, and they were somewhat optimistic. It basically said, out of a lot of different ethnic groups and women, that most, like 80%, were optimistic that their companies were actually going to make an improvement. When you look at the numbers, though, from what Jason and I shared, it might be improvement, but we got a long way to go. So before we jump into how do we fix it, there's a lot of confusion out there between diversity, inclusion, and equity. We throw this DEI out there. Now, I know we're supposed to be talking about inclusion, but I don't know how we get to inclusion without talking about all three. So can you give us a brief, real quick, what's your definitions of each of them?
Sure. So I'm going to start with inclusion. Inclusion is how people feel and whether they're considered in the decisions that are being made in a company. And in most companies, there's somebody who's included, and there are usually some people who aren't. So the question isn't, do we have inclusion? The question is, for whom do we have inclusion in our company? Diversity is about all the different perspectives that people bring when they work for an organization or when they just show up in life. And diversity can take on an infinite number of dimensions. Most companies are focused very heavily, just as you were in the opening bit, in the opening segment, very focused on gender, on race and ethnicity, but there are so many different dimensions of diversity that we can discuss. I go into a lot of those in my book. And I would say equity is, the question for equity in my mind is, what are the additional steps and considerations we need to take to bring inclusion to those who have not had it before? Because it doesn't happen by default. We have to make concerted effort. And I think that's where a lot of these initiatives, the intent doesn't match the impact, because a lot of organizations, a lot of people in organizations look around and say, yeah, I guess that's important, but that's not my job. Or, yeah, okay, but then they keep doing things the way they used to do them. They don't really make an effort to change and do something differently. I hope that clears that up.
Yeah, it's a great roadmap and a great discussion. And I know, just as you're talking, and I try to stay on top of this, there were so many things going through my mind. One of the people that comes to mind is a guest and a friend of mine. And our listeners can go back and listen to, she's been on 2 or 3 times. Her name is Solange Chara, which is her last name, Charas. She has a company called HC Moneyball, which is Human Capital Moneyball. And she shared, because she does a lot of statistics in the background. She's in HR, but she's really a data scientist. She basically identified that even within companies, they said, well, we give equal opportunity for people of every race, gender, ethnicity to enter into our management training program. But then you have to look at the next step. Why is it that coming out of those programs, there's so few non-white men who get promoted?
Mm-hmm.
So we checked off the box that everybody had an opportunity, but at the completion of those opportunities, they never moved up. So it's really unique. So which sort of brings up, other than they're getting the statistics wrong or ignoring them, why are so many organizations getting it wrong? Or why are so many organizations struggling to really turn their words and good intentions, I will give it to them, words and good intentions, into action?
So I think there are a couple of things at play here, Ira. One is a lot of organizations manage change as one-off situations. So let's say we've got a new software implementation, that's a change, and we manage that change all the way through from beginning to end. If we have, let's say we've got a new payroll system, we're going to implement that change as its own thing, beginning to end. We have an office move, now that's another change. Employees and managers are battling changes from every department all the time in organizations. And I think a lot of times they're not given a framework for them to process the change effectively. So when we manage each change as its own issue, as its own problem, as its own process, we really rob our employees of the opportunity to digest change in general in a way that is repeatable and that works for them. And I spend a lot of time helping companies and individuals process all kinds of changes, because really any initiative is a change. Diversity and inclusion initiatives are no different. Now, I want to go to this notion of, if a company implements a quality initiative, let's think about the way that they might roll that out. They're going to start at the top. They're going to have the CEO come out, and the CEO will say, we've got a new quality initiative. And they're going to say, the first thing they're going to say is because, and they're going to talk about some problem that they've had in the past, some market opportunity that they're driving toward. They're going to put this in a broad context, right? They're going to get everybody really excited about the quality initiative. And then they're going to change things structurally in the company that make quality a priority, not just for the senior leaders, not just for the CEO and maybe a couple of people in the C-suite, certainly not for the director of quality that's stuck in a department somewhere 10 levels down away from the CEO. Quality then becomes everybody's job, and everybody gets a quality measure in their annual performance review. Everybody has to measure against this. And people see a clear connection, because if you're going to do a quality initiative, one of the things you have to do is you have to go through every role in the company and figure out, how does this role contribute to or detract from our quality initiative? How do we tie what we're trying to accomplish to this person's job and make it important for them, to buy into this initiative? And I think where we break down on diversity and inclusion initiatives is people think that's somebody else's job, number one, or number two, yeah, that's great, but I don't have time for that. And they don't have time for it because it's not been put into context. The business case isn't clear. How that relates to me as a person or me and my job function isn't clear. My boss isn't measured on it. I'm not measured on it. And, I don't have time to go to, the donut, and coffee happy hour at work on Friday that probably is most of what the inclusion and diversity initiative is going to be about anyway, right? So we don't infuse it all the way down like we would quality or ethics or process improvement or a lean initiative. And I think that's a real disconnect for most people. They don't see it as important as the other changes because it's just not managed that way.
Amy, do you think that unconscious bias, does it kind of create a roadblock in terms of being able to get meaningful change around DEI?
Oh goodness. So unconscious bias is a double-edged sword for me. I think it's an important place for people to start, because we don't typically see the enormity of the pattern matching that we do in our brains. And unconscious bias is really about pattern matching, right? We're primed all day, every day with marketing messages, with media, with the messages from our families and our communities and our and our society about how to interpret things, right? all of the stories that we've ever been told in our lives give things meaning. And all of that meaning that we ascribe to things then becomes this unconscious, if this, then that, or these subconscious kind of ties between things, right? Between events and meaning in our minds. The reason it's bias is because we always prefer one thing over another. That's just the way we are, right? I like Oreo ice cream more than strawberry ice cream. That's just kind of the way I'm wired. And so, I might not think about that when I go to order ice cream. I want the Oreo ice cream. That's just what I always get, right? And I don't stop and think, well, maybe this place has the best strawberry ice cream in the world, right? We kind of go through these things very odd. I'm missing the word, very automatically. Now, we do that with people too, right? We tend to be gravitated toward people who look just like us, think just like us, talk like us, dress like us, eat like us, have the same, pop culture references that we do, all of those things. And when we find a place where we fit in, right, where we feel a sense of belonging or we feel a sense of inclusion, we tend to kind of think, well, everybody feels that way too. But it's just not the case, right? And that's why I say some companies have inclusion for some people, but not for everyone. So that's one part of unconscious bias and why it's so important. But I think we need to go beyond just recognizing, just beyond the awareness that we have these unconscious biases, right? We have these preferences that we don't readily recognize. That's fair to say. But then what do we do about it? And that's where I think a lot of training in this space falls short, because we don't talk about, well, what steps do you need to take to change that? How do you move? I always tell my audiences, everybody wakes up thinking their heart's in the right place, but your heart can't be in the right place if you never move your feet. So how do we move our feet? What steps do we take to move in the right direction, to recognize that we have a bias and then work to counteract that bias? Now, when we have bias in mass, right, when everybody has those biases, or when most of the decision makers have those biases, or when those biases are built into our processes, that creates systemic barriers to people who have been historically excluded. And that's why you might say, well, our program's open to everybody. I was having a conversation yesterday with a gentleman who said women just don't advocate for themselves as much as men do. And I said, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Well, men always stand up and say that they have the answer, or they can do this. And I said, well, what do you think happens to the women who stand up for themselves in the workplace? Oh, well, they're probably punished for it, right? What are the odds they're going to keep doing that? Right? Women negotiate as often as men, but women are punished for negotiation. So even though the opportunity may be there, and even the behaviors may be the same, it's not received the same way. And that's why people may not raise their hands as often, right? Because if every time you put your hand up, somebody smacks it, and every time somebody else puts their hand up and they get a high five, right? You learn really quickly who's allowed to put their hand up and who's not. So I think that these things work their way in. The other thing I want to say about this is the people in your organization know who gets a high five and who gets their hand smacked. They see it all day, every day. They look around and they notice. And if you think you're getting by with it, if you think that, well, yeah, we tried some things and it looked good, and we can pat ourselves on the back and be done at the end of the day, think again. Because I guarantee you, every person who has ever got their hand slapped and seen everybody who looks like them get their hand slapped, they know, they talk about it, and they're looking to go somewhere else. And just this morning, there was a report that there are 5 million more open positions than there are people looking for work. So even if everybody who is right now looking for work got a job, there'd still be 5 million open positions in this country. Now think about what that means if you've got people who are getting their hands slapped for speaking up for themselves, for advocating for themselves, for volunteering for new assignments, for trying to improve the processes or the systems, trying to create opportunity for themselves and others. If you're slapping their hand and not giving them a high five, they're going to go somewhere else.
Amy, we talk about that all the time, and that's sort of, you just hit my spot, talking about the labor stats, the perfect labor storm, or the Great Resignation. And yeah, even before 5 million is even greater than it was before. I think it was like 4 million or foursome. So it's getting worse. despite the fact that we have all these challenges and we potentially may be in a recession and people are thinking it's just going to flush out. And the reality, we had Gad Levinson just a few months ago from Burning Glass Institute, formerly from the Conference Board, and he shared that. But the number is basically about 0.5 or 0.6 people available, unemployed people for every job. So you're right. If every company would hire right now, my line, if they can fog a mirror and they had warm blood, you got a job. That's the minimum qualification. Either half of the people that are still looking wouldn't have anybody, or everybody's going to hire a part-time person, and then you still have a partial opening. So, and not all those people are obviously qualified. Before we go, I just want to clarify. I just want to give credit to Alexandra Levitt from Wall Street Journal, because I really butchered the title of the report. I'd go to look up the workplace report. For those of you who are watching, you can see it scrolling. For those that are listening, is the workplace report. Has your DEI strategy actually changed anything? And you mentioned this, and this is more confirmation than anything else. Let me see if I can find this. The comment that was there is, one thing is clear. DEI strategy can't be an afterthought. DEI progress doesn't just happen because someone takes this work on as a part-time gig. It's a constant multi-year journey that must be tied to the organization's mission. And I'll go one step further. If you're a public company, it's got to be tied to your SEC filing, because it's now required that if you say people are our most important assets, it's prove it.
Yeah, you think about all of the data that companies report in their quarterly statements, right? That they send out to shareholders, that they send out to their employees. And it is typically not very clear, some of these barriers in those reports, right? We can see, down to the penny, what they're spending on marketing and advertising, but we can't really tell what are they doing in terms of, building opportunity within their company. What are the pay gaps between men and women generally? What are the pay gaps between, white women and Black women, white women and Hispanic women, white men and Black men in the company? And so these things need to be brought to light so that they can be addressed. We can't manage what we don't measure, and we can't improve what we can't see.
This is really an indictment, as you brought it up. Women of color, and this was from the McKinsey report. Women of color actually lost ground over the last 3 years. So while white women have been promoted, made incremental changes, they're still well underrepresented. Women of color actually fell behind white women and men of color.
Mm-hmm.
And their pay, you mentioned pay equity. Women of color get paid 58 cents on the dollar. On average, it's 82. Most women,
Mm-hmm.
There's 82 cents on the dollar compared to man. Women of color get paid 58. I think it's 58, maybe 59 cents, whatever it is. It's really, really low.
Yeah. And those are averages that take into account Black women, Hispanic women, and Asian women. Asian women outperform in terms of dollars, right? Black women and Hispanic women. So even within those gradients, like the deeper you look, some people say, well, why is everything, why do you break everything out that way? Well, it's because people are experiencing the world differently because of those demographics, because of those characteristics, and not just because of the characteristics, but because of the barriers that are in place to keep them from, and I don't want to say earning, because they're not earning less, they're being paid less. This is wage theft, let's be clear. And I also, to your point about white women, I'm going to get in a little trouble today, if that's all right, but I want to say that most diversity and inclusion initiatives, once they see a woman in the next level of leadership, right, and it's usually a white woman, it's almost always a white woman. Yeah, they do. Oh, we're done. We're good. It worked. And here's what happens. White women have been and continue to be some of the worst gatekeepers in corporate spaces, in public spaces, in social spaces, right? White women tend to get high enough to keep everybody else out. And I'm saying this as a white woman, we need to do better. We need to see that our struggle is no more important than the struggle of everybody around us. And I think too many of us are so busy focused on the obstacles ahead of us that we never take time to just stop and look and see who didn't get as far as we did. And what are the obstacles they face, and how do we clear some of those out? And so, this is a call to, if you've been the benefactor of some of these programs, stop moving forward and start reaching a hand back, because we really have to get everybody across the finish line together. That's how we win. That's how our companies win, because we're leaving talent on the table. That's how our country wins, by making sure that everybody is as fully invested and producing as much as we possibly can, right? But it's also how we win personally, by making sure that the best ideas come forward, that we have the richest professional networks, that we are championing the best people, that we are really, to my earlier point, moving our feet so that our heart can truly be in the right place, because until we make those changes, nothing changes.
And Amy, that's a lot of the work that you do at Lead at Any Level, right? Is what are those action steps that leaders can actually take? And I love the tagline that you have in your company, which is helping to turn reclusive nerds into inclusive leaders. Can you unpack that a little bit for us and share with our listeners what are maybe 1, 2, or 3 actionable steps, regardless of where any company is, that are really good about becoming a more inclusive culture?
Yeah, so I would say, and I'm gonna pivot that just a little bit and say, right now companies are really worried about turnover, right? They're very worried about people leaving. They're worried about these open positions. There's sort of this downward spiral that happens when you have a lot of open positions. People tend to leave. So, and the Great Resignation did not affect everyone the same. Going back to, men and women don't experience the workplace different. They didn't experience the Great Resignation differently either. They didn't experience the pandemic the same way. And even among that, so all of the job loss we saw right at the beginning of the pandemic was not just women. White women actually were held about steady. It was Black women and Hispanic women primarily that left the job force in droves. So here's what I want to say to employers. If this is something that's on your mind, number one is remain flexible by managing to results, not to effort. Butts in seat management does not work anymore. That is not an appropriate use of most people's time, most managers' time. So we need to train our managers differently, right? Because everything's changed in our companies except for the way we lead and the way we manage. Number two is to improve job satisfaction by tailoring the role to the employee. And I'll give you an example. If you've got a salesperson who is a fantastic salesperson, but they hate doing paperwork, hire an assistant to get the paperwork done and let that person sell. Because if you bog down a good salesperson with paperwork, they're going to leave to go someplace where they've got an assistant and they don't have to do the paperwork, right? Now, you may have somebody who is maybe a more introverted salesperson, same team, right? And maybe you work out with that person because they need that downtime of paperwork to recharge to go out to sell. We'll work out with that person. Maybe you have them on different compensation strategies, different compensation plans. So one person is paid, a slightly lower hourly rate and higher commission for their sales, but one person gets a higher hourly rate because more of their job is administrative. You're going to have to customize these things because people aren't going to stand for it. They'll just go somewhere else. And the third thing is measure inclusion in your company. Who feels included? How included do they feel and why? And use that, take a baseline right now. There are ways to do this. If you have if you don't know how to do this, call me. I have an assessment tool that I use, but there are all kinds of ways to measure inclusion in your culture. Get a baseline and then manage to that. Find where the weak spots are and shore them up. Pick one metric you want to change this year and work like hell to change it. That's the only way anything's going to change.
Amy, it always comes down to measurement, doesn't it? And again, and I don't want to fall into the diversity trap. When you say, "Oh, we are measuring it, we're making progress," it's not just diversity. It's not just the quotas that you've got the percentages right. That does not mean you're inclusive. So when you're talking about measurement, it's also getting that subject. Where you started the show is inclusion is about the emotion, is how people feel. That's what have to be measured. And the HR stats that get collected that, well, we've got 50% of women here and 40% here. If they don't feel that they're more than a number, it doesn't work. And we are going to take a quick break. We want to thank everybody for listening to Geeks, Geezers, Googlization, for being part of Googlization Nation. We're with Amy C Waninger today, and we've been talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, mostly inclusion, of how to make those steps. A couple two real quick announcements. If you're not getting my newsletter, we talk about never normal news all the time. Certainly, this is what this topic is about, Never Normal News. You can go to nevernormalnews.com, and it'll take you right to the LinkedIn site there. And also, which pertains to today, how do you change people's mindsets? It's about having a growth mindset. And the new AQ Plus mindset is available. It's a 30-day coaching program. So please go up there and learn a little bit more about it, or message me or Jason, and we can certainly get you introduced to it. We're going to take a real quick break and hear from our sponsor, and we will be right back.
Change doesn't pick favorites. No matter who you are or where you live, the year 2020 was filled with one unexpected challenge after another. According to the authors of The Adaptation Advantage, we are incredibly well prepared for the past, but woefully unprepared for the future. That leaves millions of people feeling scared, worried, frustrated, and confused. Whether you're the owner of a business or a worker out of a job, adaptability is now an essential skill you need to ride the next wave of normal. The good news is that science shows that adaptability is learnable. Adaptability gives us the confidence and courage to think about change and embrace opportunity in the right way. Adaptability gives us hope for a better future. And goodness knows we need hope. Are you ready to embrace change and double down on your future? Contact Success Performance Solutions today to schedule a consultation about how you can reimagine your team's future, how you can begin to think about opportunity the right way.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to Geeks, Geezers, Googlization. Thanks for being part of Googlization Nation. Our guest today is an inclusion expert, Amy C Waninger, and we've been having a great conversation about diversity, inclusion, and equity, and why companies get it wrong and how they can get it right. Amy, one of the things that just goes through my mind, and we got to bring it out, and we talked about culture fit last week, the problems with that. And then we talked about creating a community, which seems like a better term. And then people talked about, well, not all communities are fair and don't allow all that stuff to happen. And I know unconscious bias is part of all this. And you say, well, we're trying to do our best. And let's agree that most companies are trying to make improvement, but we have these biases that we don't recognize. Any tips on how a company can avoid creating maybe the feeling of a reverse discrimination? I mean, because it almost seems that we're talking about quotas of getting more people in the workplace, but it should be based on merit, right?
Yes. So often I hear, well, we just want the best person for the job. And when I look at who companies hire, promote, right? And when I talk about companies and people, it's almost interchangeable. But let's think about this. I want everybody who's watching this, everybody who's listening to this, to think about one person you know right now who's doing their boss's job. Everybody knows one person who's doing their boss's job. Everybody knows one person, at least, who trained their boss to do their job. Right? Do you guys know somebody like that? Okay, so here's my question. If we want the best person for the job, why are we hiring someone that somebody that reports to them has to train? Why didn't we hire the person that's training them in the first place? And in most cases, and this is anecdotal, I don't have data to support this, but I'm going to guess that in most people's minds, you can tell us in the comments, if you know somebody who's doing their boss's job, or you know somebody that trained their boss, chances are the boss is a man, chances are the boss is white, and chances are the person who's doing the job or trained the boss is not at least one of those two things.
Amy, I'll give you the real life story. This is real. I can't share who it is, obviously.
Right.
But this she's about 40 years old, working for the company, been there for 10 years, has trained 2 bosses. The boss is retiring. She is capped at her compensation. She's an hourly employee, but she's trained her boss. She's capped at that level. And because this gets into a whole other category, because she doesn't have more than a high school degree, which isn't required to do the job. But because it's like, this is the highest level you can move into our company, although you are capable of training the people that lead you. And just because they had an advanced degree, or it's not even an advanced degree, just because they had a college, at least a 2-year college degree, she can't move up. And they were both women, by the way, going back. So this whole cycle, going back to women not being, being the gatekeepers of this. Now, I will say that the person over that person was a white male.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's so much wrong with that story.
Yeah, I wish, and I don't like to be divisive. I really don't. But I wish that in any conversation where people say, well, what about reverse discrimination? I always want to say, show me where you fought as hard against discrimination as you fought against reverse discrimination. And then we can have a conversation about it. Because if you're only worried about one, then that's probably, and I'm going to say not even an unconscious bias, it's probably a conscious bias coming through. And, we, like I said, we talk all the time about merit, right? But going back to your example, a college degree is probably required for some work. I want my doctor to have a college degree, right? I want my accountant to be a certified accountant, right? There are places where that matters. If Deb in marketing doesn't have a marketing degree, but she's a damn good marketer, I don't care if she's got a degree. Promote her, right? And so I think a lot of these requirements are in place because they maybe were useful in the past, maybe. But anytime it's like, well, that's just the way it is, or that's the way we've always done it, it's time to reevaluate. And I think, companies need to do a better job. Managers need to do a better job of pushing back. If you've got somebody who's qualified, clearly they can do the job, they're doing the job, but they don't match the requirements on paper, change the requirements on the paper. It's just paper.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we're sort of getting to the end here. But I gave you a really hardball question or a fastball and a curveball all rolled up into one with the reverse discrimination. But that's what we do here. I mean, we really want to put everything out there, and appreciate you being a good sport and giving a great response and a very thoughtful response. Let me throw you a softball.
Please.
Most people got into what they do for a reason. Why did you get into? Why did you become a inclusion expert? Why are you so passionate about this? Because most of the time, and I say this as a white male, it's difficult for me to talk about. I can talk about diversity and inclusion and equity, but I haven't. I can pull out examples that I might have been discriminated against because I wasn't 6'2" and an athlete, but I was 5'9" and a normal guy. But you're a white woman. So you at least have one leg up. But what brought you into inclusion?
What brought me into it was I kept wondering, what can I do about it? And I would go to conferences and I would go to training and I would go to, all of the ice cream socials and all of the things. And I wanted to know, what can I do differently? Because it's not okay with me that opportunity is available to some people, but not all people. It's not okay with me that there are super talented people whose talent is going to waste because organizations don't value them or don't want to hear what they have to say. It's not okay with me that there are so many talented people who can't get a break. And there are so many people who got a break who probably didn't have as much talent. Like, it just bothers me just in my core. And where that comes from, I don't know. But the way I got into this work was I kept showing up asking, and what can I do about it? And I'd take my notebook and I was ready. And I kept hearing about the problem and not about how to fix it. And so I decided I was going to solve for what can I personally do about it. And that's when I wrote my book, Network Beyond Bias. And I started talking to people about, how inclusive is your network? Where do you go for information? How do you even find out about things? Who are you listening to on the regular? Because if those people all look like you, you're not learning anything new and nothing will ever change. And when I wrote the book, well, even before I wrote the book, I started implementing some of the things that I learned while I was writing the book, and my whole life changed. Everything around me became richer. Everything became better. I started seeing things that bothered me in ways that I had no idea ever even existed before. It was like this veil was lifted because I started learning from different perspectives. And when that changed for me, I wanted to help other people achieve that too. I wanted to help other people do for their careers, for their lives, what I had done for mine. And there was an audience for that. There was a need for that. And once it was kind of like, once you've been to Oz, you can't go home again, right? And I decided I have to live here, and I have to help other people find this.
I think that's called finding your purpose. And that's our mission. We're talking about people first. We're part of the People Forward Network. All those things. And you just encapsulated what finding your purpose is all about. Personalized it for sure. We are rapidly moving toward the end, and we always like to have our core learn a little bit more about you, Amy. I'm going to toss it over to Jason to do our speed dating here.
All right, I
Sure,
hear
absolutely.
other answers. Got it.
Yep, here we go. We're going to do lightning round, Amy, so we can let our listeners get to know you a little bit better here. All right, so if you won the lottery today, what would you do tomorrow?
Oh, I'd pay off my mortgage. And then I'd hire somebody.
Nice. I absolutely love it. Okay, thinking back to school, what would be some things that your classmates would be surprised to see about you now?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm in touch with some of them because I went to a really small school. I think they might be surprised that I did some work in India. They might be surprised that I've led global teams. They might be surprised that I've been, hired multiple times by some brand names that, they probably have their products in their homes. I don't know that they'd be surprised that I married my high school sweetheart, though.
Very cool. And then how about a favorite book that you have, whether it's a recent one or just a favorite book of all time?
My favorite business book is called Love is the Killer App by Tim Sanders. It's a little bit old because, it uses the phrase killer app, but it really spoke to me and how you can really lead with love, learn, start by being useful, and then see what happens from there in business and relationships.
Awesome. We'll definitely check that book out. And then how about a word of the year? Do you have a word of the year for 2022?
My word of the year has been the same since I started my business in 2017, and that word is beyond.
Absolutely love it. You rocked it. Amy, we want to let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you because if they've been listening today, they know everyone needs an inclusion expert, hands down. And so that inclusion expert, we'd love for it to be you. And so how can folks connect with you, learn more about your business, and reach out and make those connections?
Sure. So the best way to find me is at leadataanylevel.com. Again, that's leadataanylevel.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn and Twitter with the handles Lead at Any Level and also Amy C Waninger, but that's a little harder to spell. So I have a company name that makes it a little bit easier. If anything that I said resonated with any of your listeners, if they want to learn more about working with me, they can go to workwithlaal.com for Lead at Any Level. Workwithlaal.com. Tell me, what's going on and how I can help, and let's see if we can't make some magic.
Perfect. And Amy, Ira and I say this every week. The time has gone by too quickly, but we absolutely want to get you back on the show again in the future. And hopefully by then, we'll have some measurement and progress indicators of improving inclusion and not just the diversity side. We can't thank you enough, Amy, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Amy.
Ira, wow. I mean, that's one of those that could honestly be a series right, with Amy in terms of inclusion, in terms of how deep we could go. What were some of your takeaways?
Well, I guess the one takeaway is we always come up early. What questions do we want to ask an expert, and that our listeners want to know? And I think we had 12. I can't remember, 10 or 12 questions, and what did we hit? 3?
Yeah.
Maybe. So definitely have to bring him back. The line of "butts in seat doesn't work anymore" was what I mean. I wrote it down. There was so much I wrote down, but it's right at the top of the list. Managers just need to change, and that's probably the good first place. Of butts and seats just doesn't work anymore. I think that summarizes it, and certainly doesn't work for inclusion. The other one was sort of a combination of what Amy said and what we talked about in the Wall Street Journal post. Is inclusion is not a part-time strategy. It's not a part-time job. It's not a bullet point on a job description. If you want to make it work, you need to devote the resources, commitment, dedication, and people to it.
That one really struck home with me too, that it's not a part-time job. And I wrote down a quote because I thought it was so powerful from Amy. She said, the question is not if we have inclusion. The question is, for whom do we have inclusion? In other words, just like we talk about, every company has a culture, regardless of whether they've planned for it and designed it. The same thing is with inclusion. You have inclusion in your company, but what Amy shared with her expertise today is the question you need to ask as leaders is, whom is included? And sadly, what we've seen with the data is there are still too many of the same type of people when it comes to the color of their skin or their gender or sexual identity that are being excluded and don't have that voice. And so we were so happy to have Amy help bring that to light today. And we want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today, too. I'm Jason Cochran. Thank you for listening to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization show. Please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that, and drop us a review as well.
And I'm Ira Wolfe. And thank you for being part of Googlization. Thank you for listening. And until next week, don't let the shift hit your plans.